You know, I really do love to be pleasantly surprised, and that is the story that we have here. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for this 1/72nd scale M4A1 Sherman tank. The model in this video here is built for my own personal collection. It's not for sale and or purchase. However, like I often mention in these build videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from scales ranging between 1/35th scale and 1/6th scale. This model here, being 172, is outside of my normal working scale purview. However, if you are interested in having me work on those other scales that I mentioned, I can be reached by the email address listed below, which is info@EastCoastArmory.com. This model here is built out of the box, or I should say predominantly out of the box. There were a couple small little additions and changes that I tweaked on the model to bring it up to the condition that we have here, and we'll be going over all that information in this video. Along with that info, I'm also going to be giving this model a thorough in-box review, so stay tuned because there's going to be a bit of info coming right at you. To start this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this vehicle here is the M4A1 Sherman tank. This is basically a vehicle that hardly needs an introduction. However, which is customary for these videos, I might as well go ahead and give a quick rundown of the vehicle's history. What is interesting about the M4A1 is that this is actually what the vehicle originally was proposed, i.e. when the Sherman tank was originally drawn up and when the mock-up and when the pilot model was produced, being the T6, this was the idea that they had in mind, where the tank was going to be an all-cast type production, which include not just the turret, but of course the hull. Of course, all of this dates back to 1942 when the original idea of the Sherman was proposed. When the vehicle received the green light and entered into production, it was supposed to be in this format. However, because of the very large castings that were going to be required to cast the all single piece upper hull, there needed to be a little bit more research and development time in order to accomplish that. So as a quick stopgap measure, the engineers went ahead and redesigned the vehicle so that rather than utilizing a single casting for the upper, they were going to utilize a mosaic type effect where you have smaller cast sections, which they did have the tooling to produce, and the remainder of the composition of the hull was going to be made from rolled steel plate. This was the original M4 Sherman. However, at the same time that vehicle was in production and was entering into service, the idea of the all-cast version never went away, and by the time the research and development was figured out and they were able to produce the vehicle specifically en masse and reliably, at this time, this vehicle would have been designated then the M4A1. This was done to differentiate it compared to the original welded mosaic version of the Sherman that I just referenced. Outside of the hull composition, both vehicles were identical in every other regard. This included the use of the same Continental radial engine, the same transmission, as well as the exact same turret. The turret at the time was a single hatch turret. They had the 75 mm for the main armament, and the secondary armament was a coaxial mounted M1919A4. In the hull, there was a secondary M1919A4 for the assistant driver. This was something that would stay all throughout the Sherman's life, and also the vehicle would have had a radio mounted in the rear portion of the turret bustle, and the option to mount another radio next to the assistant driver. Both M4 and M4A1 originally would have been utilizing several components borrowed from the M3 Lee, such as the top roller-mounted VVSS suspension and a similar designed three-piece front transmission cover. As the war went on, the three-piece transmission cover was replaced with a single all-cast unit for better armor protection, and the new Sherman pattern of VVSS suspension was developed, which was heavier duty compared to the version that was found on the M3 Lee. The M4A1s were produced by the Lima Locomotive Works, the Press Steel Car Company, the Pacific Car and Foundry Company, as well as also the General Steel Corporation produced lots of the upper hull castings. The M4A1 was produced in a large number, being over 6,200 and change, and this vehicle was widely utilized by not just the U.S. military, but was also widely exported to the United Kingdom, who used them to great effect throughout the war years. Before we continue with the video, let's go ahead and take a step back to when this model was first started in order to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplies you with. So here's the model at the start of the build. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this 1/72nd scale US M4A1 Sherman tank kit from Forces of Valor, but realistically the kit is from Waltersons. The model that we have here is a fairly new addition to the stash, where it came into my possession about a month ago, and this is a model that was a complete surprise. This is something that I didn't eagerly sought out after or track down. This model here was a complete surprise. It just showed up magically in my P.O. box from one of my really awesome YouTube subscribers. You know who you are, and I really want to give a special thank you for sending me this kit here. On a similar note, if anyone is a fan or subscriber to the channel, I really want to give a special thank you for that. Because of your subscriptions is why I continue to produce content like the one you see here. So back to the tank kit that we have here. This is from a company that I really don't have a whole lot of knowledge over compared to some of the other models that I've done reviews on in the past. Waltersons is a name that I've seen pop up from time to time. I believe they were dabbling in 1/72nd scale for a little while, and they were also working in 1/16 trying to produce a RCT-72 kit, which I'm not sure if that ever came out to see the light of day. I remember seeing prototypes of it, but that's really all I can recall on that subject. The Sherman was part of a 1/72nd scale model tank kit line that I believe they tooled up in the last 5 or so years, and within recent history the kits have been produced in this format where they have the labeling of Forces of Valor. Now, Forces of Valor is a company that I am fairly aware of because they've been around now for about 20 some odd years. Forces of Valor popped up in the early or mid 2000s time frame, and they primarily made 1/35th scale die-cast shelf display models. And the models that they produced, they were advertising them to be very highly detailed. However, one thing I can remember about them was that their quality, specifically the paintwork, was really poor on some of the first early examples. And this is something that you tend to see a lot on these die-cast tank type models. A lot of these ready to display tank models, they tend to have just a basic paint job on them, and what they then do to improve them is they just spray them with brown paint to simulate earth or mud, and it just has the effect of making the model look absolutely terrible. And this was something that Forces of Valor used to do back in the day. I believe they eventually wows up and dropped that feature, and they started selling their pre-built models without that poor weathering technique on them, and those ones actually looked pretty cool. They had an LVT, an M1 Abrams, and a few other models that escape me at the moment. However, they've been around ever since in one form or another, either in a fully built model form to a plastic kit form, or also a radio control form. I believe they also have a 1/24th scale RC tank line, if I'm not mistaken. But again, this is just going by my memory. They did produce a range of 1/72nd scale tank models. In fact, I have 1 or 2 of them in my collection that are pre-built, still in the packaging, and the detailing on them was pretty good. Now, I'm not sure if this kit here and the built ones are the same. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, they might be. I think Forces of Valor are doing the thing where they already have the molds for their pre-built models, and so they're just selling them in an unassembled kit form, much along the lines of what Dragon did about 10 years ago with their 1/6 scale tank and vehicle kits. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and look over the box art. The box art is a pretty standard box art. Here we have an M4A1 Sherman in an action-packed scene. There's an explosion going on behind it, and the model itself is decently rendered. We have here the Force of Valor logo, which has stayed exactly the same since like 2001 or so. The name of the vehicle, we have the Waltersons logo right there on the bottom corner, as well as some other verbiage. On the side tabs over here, this is vehicle number 4, and Force of Valor for their 172 tank line are doing what like the Japanese companies did back in the 1970s, where they have each kit with its own separate number, which makes collecting pretty easily done. The opposite side does not have a thumbnail of the box art. Instead, it just has some corporate info. or actually it's more just a brief history of the vehicle in question, much along the lines as we see with a Tallery, where they have the different countries with the different languages that they are found in. Side section over here, we have just some more features. The model is molded in olive drab number 9, so I guess that means that you don't necessarily have to paint it, but I am going to definitely be painting the model. This is something that's more or less geared to someone who's a youngster or is a novice, where, you know, they can build it out of the box, don't necessarily have to paint it, and it should look okay by and large. We do have a set of water slide decals, which are right over there. Obviously not a whole lot of markings to choose from. And the kit is 14 plus. I'm pretty sure I should be able to handle that. And on the rest of the side tab here, we just have some more corporate info. So opening up the kit contents, reveal the model kit on the inside. The model is all made from injection molded plastic. There are no other fancy amenities that are found on this kit, like photo etch or turned aluminum or other things along those lines. Starting with the upper hull, I can see right from the get-go that this is going to be a fairly simplistic model kit, where we have all of the superstructure details integrally molded on, and on some more advanced kits out there, these are generally separately molded pieces that the builder needs to assemble themselves. Because of this, however, the build will go by much easier compared to some of those other options that I was referring to. And we'll circle back about that towards the end of the video when I go over skill level recommendation, because there are actually some interesting things to point out with this one here. But back to the part review, even though the components are all integrally molded onto the section, you can see that the detail fidelity is actually pretty good. The detailing is all rendered. Even the hatches have the little spring details that are on them, and for the fact that they molded that into 1/72nd scale is something that's very noteworthy. The rear area over here has all of its Pioneer tools integrally molded on. This is something that's going to save a lot of time with gluing, but you're going to make up with that with painting, and again, I'll circle back on that towards the latter half of the video. But overall, the tank's geometry looks to be pretty good, and I don't see why this shouldn't build into a nice piece. On the lower hull here, we do have some lower details, such as the axis panels that are found on the bottom portion of the vehicle. And there's really nothing much else going on over here. Standard. It looks like it has the rear mud flaps integrally molded on. We'll see how that pans out as the build continues, if I keep them or not. And this runner here, quite obviously, is the suspension. The suspension is a two-part assembly. However, it is mostly pre-assembled in this state, where we have the wheels, the swing arm, the idler, or the roller, and even the skid rail all integrally molded onto the truck housing. And then it just gets topped off with some phase detailing that we have right here. This really does save on the complexity immensely, specifically for a Sherman tank, because there's a lot of little fittings going on over here, and rendering them in one piece does really streamline the assembly quite a bit, as one would imagine. I believe Dragon also did something like this on their 1/72nd scale Sherman. It's been a really long time since I built that one, but I remember vaguely seeing something similar to this on that build as well. So it's not something that's that out of the ordinary, but it is something that looks nice, and it's a nice shortcut nonetheless. And it's a shortcut that doesn't really cause any problems per se, outside of maybe painting, but you're gonna have to paint those tires regardless. And on 172, yeah, it's a bit tricky. On the remainder of the runner, we have here the rear idler as well as the sprocket, and the detailing on them also looks to be very well done. The sprocket is the earlier pattern with the spokes. And again, the spokes are actually hollow molding, so that's a very nice touch indeed. There's no other options in terms of different type of sprockets or anything. What you see here is what you get. This runner over here consists of some more components to flesh out the model. Here we have the rear firewall along with the engine hatch. Obviously, the big cutouts are for all the detail fittings to be affixed into these locations, and we'll see how that pans out. Here we have the front transmission cover. It does have some cast texturing integrally molded on, which again is a very nice touch. The rivet strip detailing is there. If I could get it in focus, we'll see what that looks like once the model's fully painted. And we have some other details, such as the Browning M2HB right there. We got some taillights, some headlights, and even the siren brush guard, as well as what appears to be the bow 1919. The next and final standard plastic runner is the turret, and as one can clearly see, this model here does have a very low parts count, which again will attest to what I'm going to be mentioning about the model in the skill level and recommendation section at the end of the video. But as for the turret itself, you can see that the kit does have some very nicely rendered in cast texturing. The early split hatch cupola is right there, along with the other details which would be present on this pattern of vehicle. We have here the lower turret pan. The mantelet is there. I will say that the mantelet is a bit overly simplistic. It's just some, it looks like cylinder sections that are just overlapped on each other, and the real M34 mantelet has a little bit more curvature to it than that. But again, for what the kit is, the mantelet, works just fine. There we have the rotor drum below it. It does have its little fasteners present on the surface, which is a nice touch. And we do have some other fittings like the shell ejection port and the remainder of the cupola hatches, as well as the main 75, which is a single piece molding, and even cooler, the end section there is drilled out from the get-go. So if you don't have the proper tools to drill something like this out, this kit here takes care of that for you right out of the box. The final runner is something that's a big relief for me, and that is the tracks. And the tracks are single piece vinyl because waltersons or Forces of Valor aren't nuts. So the track is the rubber chevron pattern and look to have some really good detailing found on the surface. And these tracks should do the job just fine. On the same rubber sprue, interestingly enough, we have a tank commander. That's something that's a little different compared to other models. And we do have what appears to be a couple polycaps here, probably for the elevation or some other type of device, but we'll see how that pans out as the build commences. Okay, on the bottom here, we have a set of water slide decals. It's a blue paper type water slide, and from what I can see here, the decals look to be a good quality, and we'll see how that looks once they are applied to the model and once the VMS matte varnish is applied. Here we have the instruction sheet. Pretty fancy instructions. It kind of reminds me of the World War II's kits with the way the graphic design is done. It's all CAD drawings. And, basically what you see is what you get. The paper stock is pretty thick on this. Like I stated before, it's very similar in quality and in materials as was seen on the World War II's model kit instructions, which are also pretty nicely done as well. As you see the track, it's very similar to larger scale builds in 135, where the two sections just simply glue together, giving you the track bands, and then they should just go into their appropriate locations, but we'll see how easy that is when it comes to actual assembly. And there we go. Pretty much everything you need for a fairly simple and hopefully a quick build, which is the reason why I'm jumping on this one here, because I already have a ton of builds going on right now, and this one here should be something I more than likely should be able to get done in practically no time. So let's cut across to when this model is finished. Starting with the model suspension, all of the components that you see here are stock and went together with the stock method, and basically these are the stock results. The suspension housings, like I mentioned before, are a two-part assembly, and because of that, you do have a little bit of seam work to contend with on the faces. Now, this is something that is not necessarily a must-do, but if you do want to improve the model and just polish it up from the kit condition, the deletion of the seams is definitely one that I personally recommend. This was easily done with a little bit of super glue. Because of the smaller size of the parts, the thick super glue is really all that was required in order to polish everything down. So a basically a nice little dab of super glue on the various locations where the seams are present, were then just polished away with some needle files and some sandpaper, and then once completed, the seam work was concluded. Clearly, this is a type of procedure that you want to do before the bogie housings get assembled to the side of the model. And on that note, on this model here, and this is also true for basically most of the other 1/35 scale Shermans that I worked on in the past, where the suspension housings are really installed after the model is actually painted. And this is done so that you can thoroughly paint all areas of the suspension housing as well as the lower hull itself. On this model here, however, though, this is actually something that's really important because of the way the wheels are molded. Unlike other Sherman tanks out there where the wheels are able to pivot, because of the smaller scale, and as I mentioned before, the wheels are integrally molded into the housing. This is something that you have to paint with a brush, and it does require a bit of very precision hand painting in order to accomplish. It's not impossible, but it is much more easily done when the suspension is off of the model compared to when it's fitted in place. So on this one here, basically the suspension is one of the last components to get fitted to the build just prior to the model sliding off into completion. Like I routinely mention on these Shermans with the VVSS, the return rollers are actually made of steel and they are not rubber rimmed. And on this model over here, I weathered them in the same exact format that I touch upon in my other builds, where I use silver paint to paint these sections here where the track would constantly rub up against them. And the same is also true here for the rear idler wheel. These are, again, not rubber rimmed on the VVSS Shermans, and because of that, they are always steel. And if you're building any sort of Sherman model, regardless of the scale, be sure not to fall for the rookie mistake by painting this black. It would indeed be a polished steel color. For the sprockets, they went together out of the box, nothing to mention there. And this leads us to the tracks. The tracks that you see here are the kit supply tracks, and they are single-piece vinyl, which I personally love. The one thing, though, about the tracks is that on this particular example, I noticed that they were very, very, very tight. Because of that, that did actually make the installation of the tracks a bit problematic. Clearly, I was still able to pull it off, but if you're working on one of these models, you do want to pay attention to this because this may be a thing that you might run into. First, I do want to mention the paint work. Like I always mention, single-piece vinyl tracks are never painted with rattle can spray paint. If you do that, you're going to basically play Russian roulette with the tracks potentially dry rotting on you or just crumbling or having a negative effect with the paint. I always paint my single-piece vinyl tracks with Tamiya acrylic. All the tanks I've done so at this point are in perfect condition, and so much so that I utilize it for all of my builds, regardless of the make of the single-piece vinyl. The second thing is, with these tracks, they are the rubber chevrons, so you want to paint and weather them accordingly. The middle section would be rubber, so is the inner pad, and the teeth sections are made out of steel, so when you're painting your tracks, be sure to paint and weather them in that type of format, where the weathering would be what you would expect to see on rubber, and steel, so on and so forth. So, again, there's a lot of people out there that just take like silver paint or rust paint and they go ahead and slap it on the whole track. And if you do that, you're actually hurting the look and you're not really improving anything. One other thing I want to mention about the tracks is that if you follow the instructions, you're going to have a mistake. If you look at the instructions, they want you to install the tracks with the tracks mounted upside down. So be aware of this. This is another mistake I've seen on a lot of novice builds. They just don't know the track direction on these tanks. The track direction should be the way you see it on this model over here. It always follows the same format. Some people are going to chime in, yeah, but you know, when I was in the Army, we talked about doing a reversible track so that it confuses direction, where every fifth link, the link is removed or swapped over. And that may be the case in post-war years. However, in World War II, that was almost, or I should say, I personally have never seen that in all the photographs I've ever looked at these tanks. Can there be an outlier? Possibly. However, having said that, it's still not the entire track. So when these tracks are installed, be sure you install them correctly and not with the instruction method. So you have definitely been warned. Back to the track assembly and installation itself. So the tracks, as we saw before, are the type where you just pin them together and they secure in place. Super glue is utilized for this, and I cannot recommend super glue enough because, again, it just holds the tracks together, and that's basically my de facto glue of choice. But for this one here, you're going to need that extra strength in order to keep the track bands together during final installation. Also, for final installation, to make your job a bit easier, do not install the sprocket and the idler before the tracks are installed. Basically, and this is not just necessarily true for this one, but all or most models out there with single piece track, generally I install the track with the sprocket timed as well as with the idler in one motion. And this is the best way to ensure that the track is installed properly on the sprocket teeth, and also it just contorts appropriately to the rear idler. Again, it's the best way to do it. On this one here, the tracks are still a bit on the tighter end. As you can see, they're pulling slightly on the sprockets, not so much where it can cause a potential problem or anything, but it is something to keep aware of. One thing I want to mention about the tracks is that if you're looking for a model to play with for one reason or another, believe it or not, I do get asked that question quite often. This is not necessarily going to be the kit for that, because a lot of people, they like to have a model where they can push it across the rug or the floor and the tracks are going to roll. That's not what you're going to expect with this one here. That's just not the case. These tracks are meant to be inserted in place, set, and forgotten about. So if you're looking for playability in mind, perhaps this is not going to be the kit for you. Can you still play with it? Yeah, I mean, this is very similar to the Airfix Sherman that I had as a kid, and I still have it in my collection today. And that thing, I used to go up and down the carpet with it quite often. This one here, you're going to be expecting similar type results, but bear in mind when you do that, you're going to be potentially adding strain to the sprocket and some of the running gear, and you will open the door for breakage. That is something to consider. And also, unlike 135, where there are aftermarket replacements to repair and replace some of these problems, on 172, it's just not the same in terms of availability of parts. So that is something to consider in case you have that type of a mindset for a build. From the tracks and the running gear takes us to the rear mud flap sections. As we saw earlier in the unboxing portion, the kit does have the mud flaps integrally molded on, and this is something I never liked the way they looked like on Shermans. Shermans are beautiful tanks, however, just not with skirts. I just was never a fan of them. And this one here with the partial mud flaps, yeah, it's definitely something that wasn't going to stick around. So the original mud flaps were amputated out. I just simply removed them with a clean cut snip, and then I polished them down with some sandpaper and or needle file to bring them to the shape that we have here. However, you'll notice I didn't sand them down completely flush. You see on the back section of these very early pattern Shermans, this is true for the M4, the M4A1, A2, and even the A4, they had these little dimpy mud flaps that were present in place. I've actually built them in 1/6 scale on my M4A4 Sherman, so if you want to take a look at that build, you'll see exactly what I'm referring to. Regardless, on the model here, the pieces kind of have a similar shape to those old dimpy mud flaps. So what I basically did was I just cut them shorter and I just sculpted them a little bit to the shape that you see here, where they definitely pass as those mud flaps I was just referencing. And honestly, I think they really do improve the look of the model, and they just make it look all that much more polished compared to having those ugly mud flaps that are found on the original kit tooling. Carrying on to the remainder of the rear detailing, basically what you see is what you get. All kit supplied parts went out without any sort of complications whatsoever. And this leads us to the front transmission cover. Again, quite standard assembly. The lower hulls did have some added cast texturing to them just to give them all a little bit extra detail kick. The stock model is very nice and smooth, which is excellent. However, just to give the model just a little bit extra spice, the cast texturing was added. It was added in my usual format with the use of red putty. And for this scale here, I definitely went a little bit on the lighter side compared to what I've done on some other builds in the past, be it 1/6, 1/16, and 1/35. But it's enough that hopefully should come out on camera, the added cast texturing that was applied. This was done very precisely with my finger and also with a tool in some hard to reach areas, and once added, I think it definitely improves the look of the model overall. Again, hopefully it comes out on camera here with the focus, but it's definitely one that I enjoyed adding to this build. One thing that I generally mention on my Sherman videos, but I did not have to do it to this one here because it came with its stock, are with the brush guards. The brush guards do have that little cylinder that's found on the side, which is used for a little plug that it's used to plug up the hole when the headlights are not in place. Well, generally these are bits of detailing I do have to add as a scratch build component. However, on this one here, they are integrally molded onto the headlight brush guard. So that's actually a very nice little bit of detail that's applied with the FOV set. On the headlights themselves, no matter the size, they are still painted appropriately, where we have the lens and the blackout light properly painted. This is obviously just requires a very small paintbrush, but it's definitely one that was done regardless. On the topic of the tail, or I should say the lights themselves, you can see the tail lights, same type of thing. The one here on the left-hand side has the cat's eye in red, the bottom in silver, and the one on the opposite side has the blackout in black, and also the smaller rectangular one painted in silver as well, just like I mentioned on my other larger scale Sherman videos. On the top deck over here, getting a little ahead of ourselves, you can see the other red little paintwork, which is that on the fire extinguisher handles. Again, even in this smaller scale, you can see just how much extra color pop it gives to the build, and it's one that just requires nothing more than 2 little dabs of red paint. While on this section of the build, I do want to mention one change that I made, and that was to the main lift handles. There are the 2 on the rear and the 2 here on the front. These are new pieces, and I replaced the kit ones. The kit, as we can recall, had these sections molded in as integral blades, and this was something that I snipped away with an X-Acto, and then I replaced them with ones made from metal wire. The floor wire was bent to shape, and then I just drilled 2 small holes into the appropriate locations, and then the hooks were added to these locations. Once added, you can see how the accuracy and detailing of the model has definitely been increased. While on the top deck, or I should say the upper hull molding, I do want to mention the fit of the upper and lower sections. The fit was pretty good. However, there are 2 things I want to bring to your attention. One is a molding column that's found right here on the front transmission area, and I'll go ahead and throw a picture of it on screen now. The piece itself is a somewhat thick piece of plastic considering the scale of the model, and it needs to be deleted 100% in order for the upper to properly fit on the lower section. This is something that's very easily done. Just snip it off with a clean cut snip. Perhaps you might want to clean the area up with an X-Acto knife, and you're basically good to go. The next thing I want to mention involves the rear area that we have right here. Again, I'll throw a picture up of this model during construction on screen, and you'll see that on the bottom portion, there is actually the number, the part number that is found on the inner molding. And the part number is great that they ID the piece. However, one downside is that in my opinion, it sticks up just a little too much above the plastic. And why this is relevant is that with its location, it is actually somewhat being interfered with the lower hull rear plate over here. So when you fit the section in place, it's going to hit right up on the molding here for the rear plate, and it can potentially throw off the fit of the upper hull. On the model here, I went ahead and polished this away with a Dremel. I believe I used a high-speed removal bit or something similar to that in order to just make the area as flush as possible. Once that little bit of plastic was removed, the upper and lower hulls fit together like a dream. Back to the rear section, you get to see the paintwork on the fuel filler caps. Note, I went ahead and did my usual weathering technique of the spillage type effects. It's always a nice way to add a bit of detailing to the rear area of a Sherman. And also, this leads us to the tools. The tools are integrally molded onto the upper hull, like I mentioned before. In order to paint them, this is going to require some very precision paintwork by the builder. This is something where you want to have some very good fine point paintbrushes on hand, so you want to have some nice fresh brushes that the tips are nice and pointy on, as well as, most importantly, and this is something a lot of people don't factor in, is the consistency of the paint. The paint has to be at just the right consistency in order to paint these components. If it's too thick, it's going to be too clunky, and if it's too thin, it's just going to run all over the place and turn into a mess, and neither of which are something that you want to happen on your build. In addition to that, you'll see that I went ahead and also painted the little leather straps, which are actually what hold the tools in place. The kit has them integrally molded on, which is an excellent bit of detailing. And again, just takes a little swipe of paint on a paintbrush in the right locations in order to just make those pieces pop out. It's one of those things where the detailing is given to you by the kit. The only thing you gotta do as a builder is just go the extra mile and paint them separately, and you'll have some excellent results. And a model that'll definitely punch above its weight. For the color, I didn't go with leather, I went with khaki because, again, they came in different type of materials during this period. From leather to khaki to nylon webbing, which is something that came a little bit later on, but the khaki materials more than suffice for the model at hand. And again, it just gives the model just that much more added detail, color pop. For the handles, I went with the wood coloring that we have here, but again, This is also another option to the builder if you want to render your model with the tools painted in olive drab of one flavor or another. This is yet another option that is something to consider. And again, this is purely at more or less the taste of the builder who's working on their model. Moving upward takes us to the turret. Turret is again the kit supply part and was built out of the box, with the exception of the added cast texturing that I touched upon before. And just like with the hull, I also went ahead and add the little handles that are found on the turret casting, the two on the rear and the one right here on top of the barrel. This was done the exact same method with the same materials for the same exact results. While on the mantlet, one thing that I did mention before is that the mantlet on this kit I feel is probably one of the weaker aspects on this model. On the original mantlet, the kit has on the top portion these little like ridges that are integrally molded on. And oddly enough, these are found on the M34 pattern of mantlet, but they're on the bottom, not the top. So in order to improve the model, one quick thing that I did was with a needle file, I just simply polished away the added ridges that were integrally molded on. By doing this, the shape of the mantlet was improved tenfold, and it really made the model look that much better compared to the original kit configuration. So this is another way you can improve the kit and have it again punch above its weight. While in this area of the turret, you get to see the vane sight. This is the early pattern shark fin sight, which is more than appropriate for this pattern of Sherman. And I went ahead and highlighted by painting the top portion in red. This is a trick that I've mentioned on several other Sherman videos with this type of fitting, and it's always one that adds, again, just that much more character and color pop to the model. This is an optional bit of paint work. Most of the time they were just left in olive drab, but there have been several occasions where they would have been painted in this type of configuration. And again, it's always one that adds just that much more flair to the build. From the vane sight takes to the M2HB. This is the kit supply component, simply just painted and mounted to the model. Admittedly, the kit component is a bit on the simplistic end. It is missing several other bits of detailing that you would find on more premium kits that are out there, but for the build here, it was, more than suffice for the job. The unit was fully painted in the same techniques that I touched upon in my other videos. The weathering is exactly the same with the use of dry brushing. And also with the ammo can here, you'll see that I went ahead and painted the ammo can and the tray holder in two versions of olive drab in order to give some more differentiation and again some more color pop to the build. As I always mention, I personally like the red Bakelite look for the M2 grips, and you can see once painted how much color it gives to the build as a whole. On that note, this leads us to the antenna base, and this is the kit supplied unit. The wire is a little loose. I probably need to add a little bit of glue to that, but regardless, this here is the kit supply component. It represents a MP65 antenna base, which is something that you would see more or less on later pattern of vehicles, but again, for this vehicle here, it's more than appropriate, and it looks the part. The only thing you really have to do, again, is just properly paint it. The detailing is there, just with a little swipe of Tamiya Hull Red with a little bit of gloss, and presto, you have the antenna base properly painted. With a small Dremel bit, I believe I did drill this out in order for me to add the antenna wire, which is just a piece of thin floor wire that was painted and glued in place, but as you can see, it's running around a little bit loose at the moment. After filming, I'll probably hit that with a little drop of glue just to stiffen that up a bit. But regardless, you can see just, how much more polished it makes it look by having the antenna in its place. And that's all there is to mention about the detailing. This leads us to the paintwork. For the model's paintwork, I went with a single shade of olive drab as opposed to something with a camouflage pattern. Of course, a Sherman always looks good in OD. For the shade of olive drab, I actually utilized a brand new shade that I cobbled together. This was something that I referenced in a couple other videos in the past. And for this one here, it was actually one of the first builds where I actually applied the new shade, and I was actually really happy on how the end result turned out. For the remainder of the weathering, this was again done via the airbrush. This includes both shading, filtering, and washing in order to bring it up to the glow that you see on this build. And then the remainder of the weathering work was done with the dry brush techniques that, again, I frequently reference. For the decal work, this is the kit supply decals. They went on without any sort of problems, and the decals quality for this kit here is actually quite excellent. Once the decals went on, the entire model was coated with a coat of VMS matte varnish, as I frequently mention in these videos. It's an excellent product, and it does a really good job with adhering the decals to the side of the model, and also just making the decals just blend in as flat as possible with the remainder of the paintwork. This is definitely something that I've recommended in the past, and it's something I'm going to continue to recommend just because I really enjoy using this product on my builds, and I'm really happy with the end results that I get. And in the end, this was a spontaneous, yet a build that I definitely do not regret undertaking. As I touched upon before, this is one that literally just fell into my lap, and as what it seems like when most kits or builds fall into your lap, they tend to come out better than you would have originally anticipated. So again, I want to give my special thanks to the individual who supplied me this model in order to bring it up to the condition that we have here, and also to bring it to all of you out there on YouTube land. Regardless, the model itself, like I was alluding to before, was an excellent build. It went together very well, and the final results is definitely something that I'm very happy with, and it's going to be a nice addition to add to my collection. The model itself was more or less a problem-free build. It went together without any friction from the beginning all the way up to the end result, that we have here. And that, I suppose, is a perfect time to pivot us into skill level and recommendations. So right out of the get-go, if you're a beginner model builder where you built maybe one or two other builds in the past, or someone who's never even touched a plastic model kit before, possibly I do see someone with those type of skill sets being able to tackle this build over here. The Forces of Valor models, or I should say this particular Sherman here, was one that was fairly simplistic in its overall part count. With the limited parts count, this does make for an easy model to assemble. The only place where I personally ran into a little bit of friction, and this is something that may give someone that doesn't exactly have the skill sets a bit of difficulty, is with the assembly of the tracks. Like I mentioned before, the tracks were a bit tight on this example over here, and this is something that may or may not give someone with a very novice skill set a bit of problems. However, outside of that little area, the remainder of the build was just a breeze to work on. Again, because of the relatively low parts count, this does make the model a very quick and easy build. And if this kit here is something that a beginner can tackle, needless to say, so could someone with an intermediate to an advanced range. Although my experience in working in 172 is much more limited compared to the other scales that I work in, I have built another example of this exact same type of Sherman in 172, and that one was from Dragon. So I believe the Dragon's a good one to compare and contrast this kit to. Compared to the Dragon example, this one here is easier to build in that it has a lower parts count. However, because of that, the Dragon model will have better detail fidelity and will also have much better just overall shape and dimensions compared to the Forces of Valor counterpart. And it's because of this is why if you're someone who's an advanced range builder, generally you're looking for something that has these type of attributes. And because of that, this kit here, although can easily be built by someone who has advanced skill sets, but realistically they're going to probably look more towards that other type of kit offering for the reasons that I just mentioned. From what I was able to tell, these models are fairly prolific and are also fairly affordable, which is great for anyone to get into the hobby and add one of these to their collection. And with the lower price point and high availability, this does make this model quite appealing for anyone that wants to add some other, changes to it. The Sherman, specifically the M4A1, had a lot of different variants available in terms of you could do one with the hedgerow cutter or the tulip with the rockets, or, the sky's the limit. You even do a Marine Corps one with the wading snorkels, and this is something that does lend itself to this pattern of vehicle. And if the builder out there wants to get one of these models and mess with it in that type of format, this is a good candidate to do that for. However, I might stress again that if you are that type of person that's willing to add extra scratch building time or extra aftermarket component time to it, perhaps you maybe want to look for something that's a little bit more, shall we say, a higher end kit because of the other details, again, that I just previously mentioned. But with that said, yeah, you can easily add those other aftermarket components or scratch build some new components to this kit over here, and it'll turn out actually quite well. As for if it's worth it or not, well, again, this is best left up to the discretion of the builder. Leading us into recommendations, open and shut, if you are a Shermanaholic, I really don't need to finish that sentence. Someone else who I'd recommend this kit to would be, again, anyone who's just a Braille scale fan. If you like building 1/72nd scale models and collecting 1/72nd scale models, the Forces of Valor line from Walters is an excellent line to get into. There's a lot of variation out there, they're affordable, and they're also fairly easily come by. On top of that, they build well, build quickly, basically everything you need to have a nice little collection at your disposal. Because of those attributes that I mentioned before about this kit being the availability, the cost, and the ease of construction, this model here, as well as the remainder of the FOV line, would be an excellent candidate for anyone who's into large tabletop wargaming. Without a whole lot of investment and without a whole lot of time, you can amass quite a large number of these vehicles over here, which would be the perfect thing to have in your ranks. As I've touched upon in other 1/72nd scale model videos, 172 is an excellent scale for dioramas. Because of the smaller size of the tanks themselves, this allows you to have a larger size diorama base where you can have a lot of action and other things happening in the scene. Along with the tanks, 172 is also used for both model airplanes as well as also model ships. There are submarines, there are landing craft, as well as even PT boats in this scale, and all of which can be combined to make some very interesting depictions if one, so desires. I would also recommend this kit to a youth builder for someone that is looking to get into the world of plastic models, but they don't really have their budget or their skill sets ironed out for something that's a little bit more larger and complicated. The Forces of Valor kits here are a nice avenue to get started in this wonderful hobby. Along similar lines, if you are a older builder or someone that used to build models when they were younger but are trying to get back into the hobby, the Forces of Valor kits are a nice entry mat back into the hobby, just so you get reacclimated with a lot of your skill sets. Be it with painting, gluing, or just working with small parts, the Forces of Valor kits here are a nice friendly welcome back. And with that wraps up this model showcase video for this 1/72nd scale US M4A1 Sherman tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being small scale model showcase videos like this one over here, or the larger scale project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in loop with new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel previously. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again. I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Till then.